The Panzer IV 75mm cannon had never missed a shot in 18 months of European warfare when Staff Sergeant Jake Mudman Patterson realized his father's Iowa irrigation technique was either going to trap Hauptmann Otto Ghost Mueller's tank in a muddy death spiral in the next 30 seconds, or get Patterson and his squad wiped out by the most accurate tank commander in the entire Wehrmacht, a man who had destroyed 94 Allied tanks without missing a single shot and was about to make it 95. "Jake, he's got us zeroed in." Corporal Danny Kowalski screamed from behind a bombed-out farmhouse as Mueller's Panzer IV adjusted its aim through the morning mist near the Belgian village of Huffelise, where the German tank ace had been systematically hunting American forces during the Battle of the Bulge with mechanical precision that had never failed to deliver death to anyone foolish enough to challenge his gunnery skills. The tactical situation was hopeless by every military standard that mattered in armored warfare. Mueller's Panzer IV weighed 25 tons and carried 80 mm of frontal armor that made it essentially invulnerable to American infantry weapons, while its 75 mm cannon fired high-explosive shells with enough destructive power to collapse buildings and kill everyone inside with direct hits or near misses that created lethal shrapnel patterns. Jake's squad was trapped in a natural kill zone with no heavy weapons, no air support, and no escape routes that wouldn't expose them to Mueller's cannon during the 15 seconds it would take to cross open ground to the nearest cover. The mathematical reality was brutal. German firepower versus American infantry in open terrain always resulted in American casualties and Wehrmacht victory according to tactical doctrine developed through 4 years of successful combat operations. But what the legendary German tank commander didn't know was that Jake Patterson had grown up on a 640-acre corn farm in rural Iowa, where his father had taught him that water always finds the path of least resistance, and sometimes the best way to stop an unstoppable force was to remove the solid ground beneath it using hydraulic engineering principles that no panzer training manual had ever considered. "Danny, trust me on this," Jake shouted as he worked frantically with a broken irrigation valve that he discovered in the flooded field outside Huffelise, using techniques his father had taught him for controlling spring floods that could either save their lives or drown them all in the mud and water that was about to turn solid ground into liquid quicksand. The irrigation system that would change everything had been built by Belgian farmers in the 1920s to control flooding from the Arve River during spring snowmelt, but the war had damaged the control mechanisms and left the fields vulnerable to water management disasters that could transform farmland into impassable swampland within minutes when the wrong valves were opened at the right time. The system included underground channels carved from local stone, overflow gates constructed with Belgian engineering precision, and hydraulic controls that could redirect river water across hundreds of acres using gravity and mechanical advantage. Jake had discovered the main control valve while searching for escape routes from their trapped position, recognizing the agricultural engineering because it was identical to systems his father had built to manage Iowa River floods that threatened their farm during spring storms. The valve controlled water flow from an elevated reservoir that had been filled by 3 days of freezing rain and snow melt, creating thousands of gallons of hydraulic pressure that could flood the valley floor in minutes if properly directed. The mathematics of hydraulic engineering were complex, but Jake understood the principles from years of helping his father control water flow across their Iowa property. By calculating soil absorption rates, drainage patterns, and hydraulic pressure, he could create mud conditions that would transform the battlefield from German advantage to American opportunity in the time it took for water to saturate clay soil beneath Mueller's tank. If stories of American agricultural ingenuity and battlefield improvisation move you, hit that subscribe button. These accounts show what happens when farm wisdom meets German military precision, proving that sometimes the deadliest weapons are the simplest applications of natural forces that enemies never see coming. The unstoppable panzer commander who had never failed began his legendary career during the 1940 campaign in France, where Hauptmann Otto Mueller had achieved his first tank kill by destroying a British Matilda at 1,200 meters with a single shot that had penetrated the vehicle's thickest armor and killed the entire crew instantaneously, establishing the foundation for a combat record that would become legendary throughout the Wehrmacht. Mueller was 29 years old, a career Wehrmacht officer who had studied mathematics at the University of Munich before the war and applied his analytical mind to the science of tank gunnery with results that bordered on mechanical perfection. Otto's approach to armored combat was methodical and relentless. He calculated range, wind speed, target movement, and ballistic trajectory with mathematical precision that eliminated guesswork and reduced tank battles to physics problems with lethal solutions. The German tank commander had earned his nickname, Ghost, through his ability to appear suddenly from concealment, destroy enemy tanks with single shots, then disappear before Allied forces could respond effectively. Mueller's Panzer IV had been modified with improved Zeiss optics that provided superior target acquisition capabilities, enhanced ammunition storage that carried armor-piercing rounds manufactured to tighter tolerances than standard Wehrmacht ordnance, and a customized fire control system that maximized accuracy at extended ranges. Otto's combat record was unprecedented in Wehrmacht armor units and had become the standard by which other tank commanders measured their effectiveness. 94 confirmed tank kills across 4 years of warfare, including 23 Russian T-34s during the Battle of Stalingrad where he'd single-handedly destroyed an entire Soviet tank company, 31 British tanks during the North African campaign where his tactical innovations had earned him the Knight's Cross, and 40 American Shermans during the current Ardennes offensive where he'd demonstrated that German gunnery superiority could neutralize Allied numerical advantages. More importantly for Allied morale, Mueller had never missed a shot when firing at stationary or slow-moving targets within effective range of his 75mm cannon, creating a psychological reputation that demoralized enemy tank crews who understood that facing the Ghost meant almost certain death regardless of their own tactical skill or equipment advantages. Radio intercepts had revealed that Soviet tank commanders would abandon positions rather than engage Mueller's Panzer, while British and American units had developed elaborate tactical procedures designed to avoid encounters with the legendary German ace. Target acquired, American infantry position, range 800 meters, Mueller announced to his crew in the precise tone that had become his trademark during 94 successful engagements, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of a mathematician solving equations that happened to involve human lives. Standard high-explosive round. Fuse setting for maximum fragmentation. One shot, complete suppression. These Americans have no cover and nowhere to retreat. Mueller's tactical philosophy was based on the principle that tank gunnery was applied mathematics rather than military art, requiring precise calculations of ballistic coefficients, atmospheric conditions, and target characteristics to achieve consistent results under combat conditions. He maintained detailed firing logs that recorded every engagement parameter, ammunition performance, and environmental factor that affected accuracy, creating a database of tactical knowledge that had never failed to predict optimal firing solutions. The psychological impact of Mueller's reputation was as devastating as his physical firepower, because Allied tank crews throughout the European theater understood that encountering the Ghost meant facing an opponent whose mathematical approach to warfare eliminated the element of chance that usually provided hope for survival during armored engagements. Mueller didn't just destroy enemy tanks, he calculated their destruction with mechanical precision that made resistance seem futile. Mueller's Panzer IV was positioned on high ground overlooking the flooded valley outside Houffalize, with excellent visibility across terrain that had been saturated by 3 days of freezing rain and snowmelt from the Ardennes Mountains. The tactical situation favored German forces completely, elevation advantage that extended effective firing range, superior firepower that guaranteed penetration of Allied equipment, and enemy troops trapped in open ground with limited options for movement or concealment. But Mueller had never faced an opponent like Jake Patterson, whose understanding of hydraulic engineering and agricultural water management was about to prove that sometimes military precision could be defeated by forces of nature when properly directed by someone who understood how water, soil, and mechanical pressure worked together to create tactical conditions that no Wehrmacht training manual had anticipated. The American farm boy who understood water had grown up during the Great Depression on a corn and soybean farm in central Iowa, where his father had developed innovative irrigation techniques that allowed the Patterson family to maintain crop yields even during the devastating drought years that destroyed other farms throughout the Midwest and forced thousands of farming families to abandon their land. Jake Patterson was 23 years old, the eldest son of a farming family that had worked the same land for 3 generations without ever losing a crop to weather conditions that had bankrupted their neighbors. Jake's father, Henry Patterson, had learned water management through trial and error during the 1930s, developing systems that could redirect river water, control flood damage, and create artificial drainage that protected crops during extreme weather events that challenged conventional agricultural wisdom. Henry Patterson's reputation as a water management expert had been established during the Great Flood of 1936, when the Iowa River had risen to record levels and threatened to destroy every farm in the county unless water flow could be controlled through engineering techniques that went beyond traditional farming methods. While other farmers had evacuated their property and waited for the water to recede, Henry had stayed behind and implemented hydraulic engineering solutions that not only saved his crops but actually improved soil fertility by controlling the deposition of nutrient-rich flood sediment. Jake, his father had said while teaching him to operate the complex system of gates, channels, and pumps that controlled water flow across their property, his hands gesturing toward the network of carefully engineered waterways that had taken years to design and construct. Water is like electricity, it always takes the path of least resistance, but you can control where that path goes if you understand the engineering principles that govern fluid dynamics under pressure. The specific technique that would save Jake's life had been developed by Henry Patterson during the floods of 1936, when the Iowa River had overflowed its banks and threatened to wash away the entire farm unless water flow could be redirected away from critical areas using principles of hydraulic engineering that Henry had learned through necessity rather than formal education. Henry had created a system of temporary channels and overflow gates that used hydraulic pressure to move thousands of gallons per minute in controlled directions, essentially weaponizing flood water against the natural forces that threatened their livelihood. The engineering principles involved calculating soil absorption rates, hydraulic pressure, drainage patterns, and mechanical advantage to achieve precise control over water flow across terrain that could support crops during normal conditions but became unstable during flood events. Henry had taught Jake to read soil conditions like a book, understanding how different clay compositions responded to water saturation and how hydraulic pressure could be used to transform solid ground into controlled swampland within minutes. The secret is understanding that soil isn't solid, Henry had explained while showing Jake how to calculate the load-bearing capacity of saturated clay during different weather conditions. When you add enough water fast enough, the strongest ground becomes as soft as pudding. But if you know where the water wants to go, you can make it go where you need it to go instead. Jake had enlisted in the Army in 1942 immediately after graduating from high school, despite having an agricultural deferment that would have kept him on the farm throughout the war, contributing to food production that was considered essential to the American war effort. But Jake couldn't stand the thought of other men fighting for American freedom while he stayed home growing corn, even though farming was considered crucial for feeding both American civilians and Allied military forces throughout the global conflict. Infantry training at Fort Benning had come naturally to Jake because military engineering wasn't fundamentally different from agricultural problem-solving, both required understanding how natural forces worked and finding ways to use those forces to achieve specific objectives under pressure. Jake's rural background had given him intuitive understanding of terrain, drainage, and mechanical systems that proved valuable during combat operations in environments that challenged urban soldiers who lacked experience with agricultural equipment and hydraulic systems. The transition from farm work to military service had been surprisingly smooth because both environments required the ability to operate complex machinery under pressure while solving mechanical problems that couldn't be addressed through conventional methods. Jake's experience with agricultural hydraulics had taught him to think systematically about mechanical systems and to improvise solutions using available materials when standard approaches failed to achieve desired results. Patterson, his platoon sergeant, had said after watching Jake improvise field fortifications using drainage techniques that weren't described in any military manual but proved highly effective at protecting American positions from German artillery bombardment. "Where do you learn to read ground conditions like that? And how do you know exactly where water's going to flow before it starts flowing?" "Iowa corn fields, Sergeant," Jake had answered, not fully understanding that his father's lessons about hydraulic engineering would eventually save his life during the most desperate battle of his military service when conventional military tactics offered no hope of survival against superior German firepower. When you've spent your whole life figuring out how to control water that wants to go where it shouldn't go, you learn to think like water thinks. But the real test of Jake's agricultural wisdom had come when he arrived in Europe and faced German tactical doctrine that was designed to exploit American inexperience with European terrain and weather conditions that were different from anything American soldiers had encountered during stateside training. The deadly trap that almost worked perfectly had been set by Mueller's Panzer unit during the early morning hours of December 23, 1944. When German forces had surrounded American positions near Hufvillise and were systematically destroying isolated units that couldn't retreat due to the muddy conditions that made vehicle movement impossible and infantry evacuation a death sentence under German observation. Jake's squad had been cut off from the main American force during a German counterattack that had broken through Allied defensive lines using classic Wehrmacht tactics that exploited American inexperience with winter warfare and European terrain conditions. The squad had been forced to take shelter in a bombed-out Belgian farmhouse that offered concealment but no protection against direct tank fire, creating a tactical situation where survival depended on factors beyond conventional military training. The farmhouse was located in a depression between two hills, creating a natural kill zone where German armor could engage American infantry from elevated positions while remaining protected from return fire by American forces that lacked heavy weapons capable of threatening tank armor. The tactical geometry favored German forces so completely that escape seemed impossible without suffering casualties that would eliminate the squad's combat effectiveness. Mueller's Panzer IV had achieved perfect firing position on the hillside overlooking the farmhouse, with clear lines of sight to every possible escape route and sufficient ammunition to destroy any American attempt to break out of the trap using conventional infantry tactics. The tactical mathematics were simple and brutal. German firepower versus American infantry in open ground always resulted in American casualties and German victory according to doctrine that had been proven through 4 years of successful combat operations. The desperation of Jake's tactical situation was compounded by the loss of their radio during the German counterattack, eliminating any possibility of calling for artillery support or airstrikes that might neutralize the Panzer threat. The squad's heaviest weapon was a single bazooka with 3 rockets, insufficient firepower to guarantee penetration of German armor at the ranges where they would be forced to engage Mueller's tank. Sergeant Patterson, Corporal Kowalski had said as the squad took cover in the farmhouse basement, his voice reflecting the controlled fear of an experienced soldier who understood that they were facing a tactical situation with no conventional solution. "That German tank has us completely surrounded. We can't fight him with rifles, we can't outrun him in this mud, and we can't call for artillery support because our radio was destroyed. What are we going to do?" The other members of Jake's squad included Private Tony Benedetto from Brooklyn, whose urban background had never prepared him for agricultural terrain, Private Sam Washington from Detroit, who understood automotive mechanics but had no experience with hydraulic systems, and Private First Class Mike O'Sullivan from Boston, whose Irish heritage had given him respect for improvised solutions but no knowledge of water management techniques. Each squad member understood that their survival depended on Jake's leadership and tactical innovation, because conventional military responses to their situation would result in casualties that the squad couldn't sustain while maintaining combat effectiveness. The pressure on Jake to find an unconventional solution was enormous, because failure meant death or capture for men who had trusted him to keep them alive under impossible circumstances. Jake's answer revealed the kind of innovative thinking that separated successful combat leaders from those who followed conventional doctrine when conventional approaches offered no hope of survival. "Danny, my father always said that when you can't move the obstacle, you move the ground under the obstacle. That German tank is sitting on solid ground, but this whole valley is an artificial drainage system that can be controlled if you know where the valves are located." The tactical innovation that Jake was proposing had never been attempted under combat conditions and required understanding of hydraulic engineering that wasn't taught in military schools or described in infantry manuals. But Jake's agricultural background had given him the knowledge necessary to transform environmental conditions from German advantage to American opportunity using principles that his father had taught him for controlling Iowa floodwater. "The Germans think they have us trapped because they control the high ground," Jake explained to his squad as he prepared to implement the most desperate gamble of his military career, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who understood natural forces that his enemies had never considered. "But high ground doesn't matter if it becomes an island in the middle of a swamp that can't support the weight of a tank. The physics of Jake's plan were complex, but the principle was simple. By opening the irrigation valve and redirecting water flow toward Mueller's position, he could saturate the soil beneath the German tank and create mud conditions that would trap the Panzer in place while making it vulnerable to infantry attack using close-range anti-tank weapons that could penetrate German armor when fired from optimal positions. The technique required precise timing and perfect understanding of soil mechanics, because failure would leave Jake's squad exposed in open ground where Mueller's cannon could destroy them before they could reach effective firing positions. But success would neutralize German firepower and create the tactical opportunity necessary for American survival. The moment that changed everything came at 0847 hours when Jake opened the irrigation valve and released 10,000 gallons of diverted river water directly toward Mueller's Panzer IV, creating an artificial flood that would test German engineering against Iowa agricultural innovation under combat conditions where mathematical precision met hydraulic forces that no Wehrmacht manual had anticipated. The water struck the hillside below Mueller's tank with tremendous hydraulic pressure and immediately began saturating the clay soil that supported the Panzer's 25-ton weight, creating underground flow patterns that transformed solid ground into liquid mud within minutes. Jake had calculated the flow rate and absorption capacity based on his experience with Iowa soil conditions, but Belgian clay reacted differently than Midwestern farmland and created mud consistency that exceeded his most optimistic projections. The hydraulic engineering that Jake had learned from his father was creating tactical conditions that violated every assumption about terrain stability that German tank crews had been taught during their training. The Panzer IV's wide tracks were designed to distribute weight across soft ground, but no German engineer had anticipated soil conditions that changed from solid to liquid in real time while a tank was attempting to maintain combat position. Mein Gott, the ground is moving. Mueller's driver shouted through the Panzer's intercom as the tank began sliding sideways down the hillside, its tracks unable to maintain purchase on soil that had suddenly become as slippery as ice and twice as unstable. The mechanical systems that had never failed during 94 successful engagements were encountering environmental conditions that German engineering had never been designed to handle. Mueller had faced mechanical failures, ammunition shortages, and superior enemy firepower during his 4-year combat career, but he had never experienced terrain conditions that changed from solid to liquid in real time while his tank was attempting to maintain firing position. The hydraulic engineering that Jake had learned from his father was creating tactical conditions that no Wehrmacht training manual had prepared German crews to handle. The physics of soil saturation were working exactly as Henry Patterson had taught his son during Iowa flood control operations, but the military applications were far more dramatic than anything Jake had experienced on the family farm. Belgian clay soil had higher water retention capacity than Iowa farmland, creating mud conditions that were deeper and more persistent than Jake had calculated based on his agricultural experience. Driver, full power forward. Maintain position at all costs. Mueller commanded as his Panzer IV began an uncontrolled slide toward the flooded valley floor where American infantry were waiting with bazooka teams and close-range anti-tank weapons that could penetrate German armor at point-blank range. The mechanical precision that had made Mueller legendary was being defeated by natural forces that operated according to physical laws rather than military doctrine. The hydraulic pressure from Jake's irrigation system was creating underground water flow that destabilized soil foundation over an area much larger than the immediate impact zone, turning the entire hillside into unstable terrain that couldn't support armored vehicle weight. The German tank was experiencing the same conditions that Iowa farmers had learned to create deliberately when they needed to move heavy equipment across saturated fields during spring planting season. But the Iowa irrigation technique had created more than just mobility problems for Mueller's tank, it had reversed the tactical advantage by transforming German elevation superiority into a liability that exposed the Panzer to attack from below while eliminating its ability to retreat to safer positions. The tank that had never missed a shot was suddenly a sitting duck trapped in mud that deepened with every gallon of water that Jake's valve continued to release. Mueller's mathematical approach to tank gunnery was useless when his firing platform was sliding uncontrollably down a muddy hillside at speeds that made accurate target acquisition impossible. The optical range-finding equipment that had enabled 94 consecutive kills was designed for stable firing positions, not for combat situations where the tank itself was in motion due to environmental conditions that changed faster than mechanical systems could compensate. Skies. The terrain is completely unstable. Mueller's gunner reported as the Panzer IV's main cannon swiveled wildly while the tank slid toward the valley floor, making accurate fire impossible despite having clear visibility of American positions that should have been easy targets under normal circumstances. I cannot maintain sight alignment while the vehicle is moving laterally. The technical superiority that had made Mueller's Panzer IV legendary was being neutralized by agricultural engineering that transformed the battlefield environment from German advantage to American opportunity within minutes. Jake's understanding of hydraulic physics was proving more effective than years of military training and combat experience when applied under conditions that German tactical doctrine had never anticipated. Now! Jake shouted as Mueller's Panzer reached the valley floor and became completely immobilized in mud that reached halfway up the tank's road wheels, creating the tactical opportunity that American forces needed to engage German armor with weapons that were effective only at close range. Hit him with everything we've got while he can't move. The American counterattack was swift, coordinated, and devastating because Jake's irrigation technique had eliminated every German advantage except armor thickness, while creating optimal conditions for American infantry tactics that relied on mobility and close-range firepower. Bazooka rockets struck the Panzer's side armor at ranges where penetration was guaranteed, while rifle fire kept German crew members buttoned up inside their disabled vehicle that could no longer maneuver or retreat to defensive positions. Unmoglich, Mueller whispered as he abandoned his destroyed Panzer and surrendered to the American infantry squad that had defeated his perfect combat record using agricultural techniques rather than superior firepower. How did farmers learn to control ground conditions like military engineers? The legend that spread like wildfire began when word of Jake Patterson's irrigation victory reached other American units fighting in the Ardennes, inspiring tactical innovations that used environmental conditions as weapons against German forces who had not prepared for agricultural engineering applied to modern warfare, creating a psychological shift that affected German morale throughout the remainder of the Battle of the Bulge. Patterson, his company commander, said during the post-battle debriefing, his voice carrying the amazement of an experienced officer who had witnessed something that challenged every assumption about infantry tactics and environmental warfare. I've been fighting Germans for 18 months, and I've never seen anything like what you did to that Panzer. You turned solid ground into quicksand using nothing but a water valve and farm knowledge. How do you explain defeating the best tank commander in the Wehrmacht using irrigation equipment? Jake's answer became part of American military folklore and established hydraulic engineering as a legitimate tactical technique for infantry operations against armored vehicles, demonstrating that civilian skills could be weaponized against military targets when applied with creativity and understanding of natural forces. Captain, my father always said that water is stronger than steel when it's properly directed. That German tank was unstoppable as long as it had solid ground to operate on, but every vehicle becomes helpless when the ground disappears underneath it. The tactical innovation that Jake had demonstrated under pressure was immediately adopted by other American units who faced similar situations against German armor in muddy conditions throughout the European theater of operations. The Patterson technique became an unofficial but widely used method for neutralizing enemy tanks using environmental manipulation rather than direct firepower, proving that agricultural knowledge could be weaponized against technological superiority when conventional military approaches failed. Within 48 hours of Mueller's defeat, American intelligence officers were interviewing Jake about the specific technical details of his irrigation technique, creating field manuals that described hydraulic engineering applications for combat operations. The techniques were distributed to American units operating in terrain where water management systems could be exploited against enemy forces, expanding the tactical options available to infantry commanders facing superior German equipment. But the most significant impact was psychological rather than tactical, because Mueller's defeat by American farmers using irrigation equipment had demonstrated that German military precision could be neutralized through innovative thinking that exploited weaknesses in Wehrmacht doctrine. The psychological effect on German tank crews was immediate and widespread, creating doubts about their invulnerability that affected morale throughout German armored units and reduced the tactical aggressiveness that had been the hallmark of Wehrmacht operations. Radio intercepts revealed that German tank commanders throughout the Ardennes were reporting concerns about American agricultural warfare and requesting intelligence about Allied capabilities for environmental manipulation that could threaten German armored operations. The psychological impact of Jake's victory was amplifying fear among German crews who had previously considered their tanks invulnerable to American infantry tactics. The ripple effects of Jake's victory extended throughout the Battle of the Bulge as American forces began using similar techniques to neutralize German armor advantages in muddy conditions, creating tactical situations where environmental factors became more important than equipment superiority. The psychological impact on German morale was as significant as any physical damage that conventional anti-tank weapons could inflict, because it proved that American ingenuity could overcome technological advantages through creative application of civilian knowledge. Mueller never commanded another tank after his defeat by Jake Patterson's irrigation technique, spending the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war who provided intelligence about German tactical doctrine while struggling to understand how American farmers had learned to weaponize natural forces against military equipment that had been designed to dominate European battlefields. The psychological damage to Mueller's confidence was complete and irreversible. The scientific explanation for Jake's success revealed the sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics and hydraulic engineering that American farmers had developed through generations of agricultural experience under challenging environmental conditions. The techniques that seemed primitive to German military engineers actually represented advanced applications of physics and chemistry that achieved tactical results through environmental manipulation rather than direct military force. Young Patterson understood something about clay soil and water saturation that our military engineers had never considered, explained Professor James Mitchell from Iowa State University during a post-war analysis of the incident that was classified to prevent enemy forces from learning about American agricultural warfare capabilities. By calculating water volume, soil absorption rates, and hydraulic pressure, he created mud conditions that neutralized a 25-ton tank using principles that his father had taught him for controlling Iowa River floods. The post-war analysis of Jake's technique revealed that agricultural water management represented a form of environmental warfare that had never been formally studied by military engineers but proved highly effective when applied by soldiers who understood hydraulic engineering principles. The success of the Patterson technique led to the development of formal military doctrine that incorporated environmental manipulation as a legitimate tactical approach for infantry operations against armored vehicles. The human story that made it all meaningful was preserved in letters between Jake and his father, documenting not just the technical details of hydraulic engineering but the family traditions and agricultural wisdom that had enabled an Iowa farm boy to defeat German military precision through understanding of natural forces that transcended conventional military thinking and proved that civilian knowledge could become military weapons when applied with courage and creativity. The post-war legacy of Jake's innovation extended far beyond World War II to influence military engineering doctrine that emphasized environmental awareness and agricultural knowledge as sources of tactical advantage in rural combat environments. The techniques that Jake had learned on an Iowa farm became part of military training programs that taught soldiers to recognize and exploit natural resources as weapons against enemy forces. The human story that made it all meaningful was preserved in letters between Jake and his father, documenting not just the technical details of hydraulic engineering but the family traditions and agricultural wisdom that had enabled an Iowa farm boy to defeat German military precision through understanding of natural forces that transcended conventional military thinking. Dad, Jake wrote in a letter from Europe after the Mueller encounter, I used your irrigation techniques to trap a German tank that had never been stopped by anything the army could throw at it. Water found the path of least resistance, just like you taught me, and that path led right under a panzer that thought it was sitting on solid ground. Henry Patterson's response revealed the connection between agricultural knowledge and military success that had sustained American farmers through generations of challenges that required innovative solutions to problems that conventional approaches couldn't solve. Jake, I'm proud of you for remembering that water is patient but unstoppable when it has somewhere to go. You gave it somewhere to go, and it took that German tank along for the ride. Jake Patterson proved that the most effective military tactics often came from civilian experience and agricultural wisdom rather than formal military training, demonstrating that American democracy's greatest strength was the diversity of knowledge and practical skills that soldiers brought from their pre-war lives to combat situations that required innovative solutions. So here's the question Jake Patterson's story poses: when facing superior enemy technology, how do you find advantages in your civilian background and agricultural experience that enemies haven't prepared for? What drives an American soldier to trust his father's farming wisdom over military doctrine when survival depends on making the right decision under extreme pressure? And how does practical knowledge about natural forces become a military weapon when applied with courage and creativity during moments of desperate need? Jake Patterson proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against enemy technology is not superior firepower but superior understanding of the environment where battles are fought, combined with the agricultural wisdom to use natural forces as allies rather than obstacles when conventional military approaches offer no hope of success.